All right, well, you made it. This is the last lecture or the last new material that we've got for PEPROF 201. So we've made it to the end. So last time we did the peripheral nervous system. This time we're going to do essentially one of the branches of the peripheral nervous system, which is the autonomic nervous system. So this is a little flow chart, if you will, that you've seen before. So in terms of placing the autonomic nervous system within the greater context of the nervous system, we should probably start by talking about, so remember the two major branches of the nervous system are the central nervous system, which include the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which we talked about most recently, and that includes everything outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So remember that includes those cranial nerves, but also the spinal nerves, and then everything distal to both of those two. But then further remember that the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into sensory or afferent branches that bring information back to the spinal cord and then eventually up to the brain for processing, making meaning of that information. And then there's a motor branch to the peripheral nervous system. So that brings information away from the brain, away from the spinal cord, that causes muscle contraction is kind of the easiest way to think about the motor branch. So the motor branch then, so we're over here, is further subdivided into the somatic nervous system. And so the thing to remember about the somatic nervous system is that it is the voluntary side of the motor branch of the peripheral nervous system. So it's voluntary muscle contraction. So when you contract your biceps or you contract your quads or any number of those other things, that is part of the somatic nervous system. You decided to contract your biceps, and so then you did it. That's as opposed to the autonomic nervous system, which is what we're talking about today. So the autonomic nervous system is a division or branch off of the motor branch of the peripheral nervous system. So if the somatic branch does voluntary muscle contraction, then the autonomic branch largely does involuntary muscle contraction. So one of the things to understand about the autonomic nervous system is basically it's responsible in many ways for maintaining homeostasis. So remember, homeostasis, you want to maintain that nice, stable internal environment. And so our internal environment is constantly in flux, right? So if I go from being seated, I stand up and I walk out of the room, that increases my energy demands. And so to meet those demands, I'm going to have to see an increase in heart rate. Potentially, I might have to see an increase in breathing rate if I'm walking fast enough, right? And so those unconscious adjustments are made by the autonomic nervous system. If I switch from a walk to a run or I do more intense exercise, then we're going to have to do something like, I've referred to this a little bit before, but the concept is blood shunting, and that is directing blood away from tissues that don't need it and directing it toward tissues that do. Or if I'm just sitting here listening to this lecture, then I will want to slow my heart rate down, right? I don't need it to be as high as it was when I was walking or running or moving really quickly. Instead, I need to hit the brakes on heart rate, slow it back down. And because I don't have those energy demands on the muscular system, instead what I can do are a variety of maintenance functions. So that includes particularly digestion. So we can then cause contraction of the smooth muscles around the gastrointestinal tract that will facilitate absorption of all the things that I just ate. And so the parasympathetic branch is responsible for a lot of that. So as you can see there's two subdivisions to the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division, which you're going to hear several times throughout this lecture, is the fight or flight division. And then the parasympathetic division, which is the rest and digest side of things. So one thing, and I'll touch on this again later, but the autonomic nervous system doesn't, so I mentioned that it's automatic, right? And largely it is, but it does function to some extent under conscious control. So we do have some influence under those automatic functions, but in general, those things happen without our ever being aware of them. So for example, if you go from not doing anything to now you're engaging in exercise, you're going to see an increase in oxygen demands on the part of the muscles, and so we're going to have to direct blood to the muscles. You're probably not aware of that change in blood flow, but that just happened on its own, right? So most of those changes happen unconsciously, but from a conscious standpoint, we can influence some of the things that the autonomic nervous system does. All right, so some specific differences between the autonomic nervous system, which is what ANS is at the top of the slide, and the somatic nervous system. The first are the effectors. And so the effectors are essentially what carry out the orders of those neurons. So in the case of the autonomic nervous system, the effectors, the things that are at the other end of those neurons, include smooth muscle. So for example, the muscle around your gastrointestinal tract, muscle or a muscular layer that surrounds arteries and veins, causing them to constrict. Smooth muscle in the eyes, we'll talk about that here in a minute. Other effectors for the autonomic nervous system include cardiac muscle. So your heart has its own pacemaker, which is, you don't need to know this, but something called the sinoatrial node or the SA node. We'll get to that in PEPROF 202. We'll talk about that quite a bit. But left to its own devices, the heart is going to, or that SA node is going to depolarize about 100 times per minute. And so your resting heart rate would be 100 beats per minute. But of course it's not. So for most of you, it's probably around 70. The better conditioned you are, your heart rate's probably a little bit lower. Maybe for many of you, your resting heart rate's in the 60s. Or if we have any endurance athletes, maybe your resting heart rate is down in the 40s. So what governs that, the reason that your resting heart rate is below 100 is because of the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. But if you switch from resting to exercising, then you're going to have to speed your heart rate up over 100, right? And so then that's the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system does that. And then glands, so different components of the autonomic nervous system either inhibit or facilitate secretions from glands. So for example, and most of those are parasympathetic, but for example, the autonomic nervous system causes the increase in production of mucus in the nasal gland, causes tear production, causes saliva production, production of gastric juices to aid in digestion, a number of other things like that. So the autonomic nervous system then governs the production of or excretion from glands. Actually, secretion is could be either, depends on the gland, never mind. All right, as opposed to the somatic nervous system, so remember the somatic nervous system, voluntary muscle contraction, so the only effector for the somatic nervous system then is skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle. All right, so there is a little bit of a structural difference between the two. The first is that the autonomic nervous system, the efferent, the motor pathway, consists of two neurons. And there's some important language here that I'm going to talk about a lot that's helpful to understand at the outset of this talk. So because it's a two-neuron chain, I'm going to talk about the pre-ganglionic neuron and the post-ganglionic neuron. So the pre-ganglionic neuron, well, I should back that up a little bit and talk about a ganglia. And you've heard this term before. But a ganglion is singular, and so that is a cluster of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the brain or spinal cord. As opposed to a cluster of cell bodies inside the brain or spinal cord is called a nucleus. So ganglia then are plural, so those are multiple clusters of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the brain and spinal cord. All right, so having said that, so again, the autonomic nervous system, structurally, you've got two motor neurons. So you've got the pre-ganglionic neuron, which is the one that, so where they sit, the cell bodies for the pre-ganglionic neurons sit either in the brain stem or in the spinal cord. And then their axons are going to leave the brain stem or leave the spinal cord, and then they are going to synapse to connect with a second neuron. So they're going to relay their signal to the second neuron. And that second one is called the postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron in the autonomic nervous system lives in the brain stem or spinal cord. It's going to initiate that signal. It synapses with a postsynaptic neuron, which then relays that signal out to the effector, whether that effector is your sweat glands or your liver or smooth muscle around the stomach or gastric pits in the stomach itself. So that postsynaptic neuron is what communicates directly with the effector. That's as opposed to the somatic nervous system. There's only one neuron, right? And so that neuron, from that standpoint, the somatic nervous system is a little more straightforward. So that neuron that I'm talking about is that same alpha motor neuron that we talked about with motor units back in chapter 9. So in the case of the somatic nervous system, that alpha motor neuron lives in those ventral horns of the spinal cord. And so I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. So that alpha motor neuron then, its axon runs out that ventral root of the spinal cord. Again, call back from last time. So its axon runs out that ventral root of the spinal cord, runs into that spinal nerve, the dorsal or ventral ramus, etc. on out. But eventually, the axon of that neuron terminates with skeletal muscle. So that alpha motor neuron, the one neuron in the somatic nervous system, is going to communicate with skeletal muscle, and it's going to cause skeletal muscle to contract. All right, so in addition to 2 neurons in the autonomic nervous system, a 2-neuron chain versus 1 neuron in the somatic nervous system, there's a difference in myelination. So remember that myelination is fat wrapping around the axons of a neuron, and the more myelinated, the better myelinated an axon is, the better able that neuron is to conduct its signal quickly. So a myelinated axon conducts a signal, an action potential, much more quickly than an unmyelinated neuron. Speaking of, so on the autonomic side of things, so remember we got a 2-neuron chain, presynaptic, postsynaptic neurons. So the presynaptic neuron is myelinated, but it is fairly lightly myelinated. So because of that, it doesn't send its signal quite as quickly as the somatic neurons. We'll talk about those more in a second. So the pre-ganglionic neuron is myelinated, so it sends its signal relatively quickly, but not as well as it would if it was more completely myelinated. And then the post-ganglionic neuron is unmyelinated. So then the post-ganglionic neuron sends its electrical signal relatively slowly. So remember, we talked about the type C fibers when we talked about first order efferents, and that the type C fibers only conducted their electrical signal at about 2 miles an hour or something to that effect. Pretty sure 2 miles an hour was the example number I gave, but it's a relatively low speed, as opposed to, remember those A alpha efferents, the biggest and the best myelinated sensory neurons, are able to conduct their electrical signal at 300 miles an hour. So the somatic motor neurons are of the same type in terms of the diameter of the neuron or of the axon and the degree of myelination of the axon. So your somatic motor neurons are very similar to those A alpha efferents that we talked about in the first order efferents, where they conduct their electrical signal really, really fast, so that 300 miles an hour conduction rate. As opposed to, again, that post-ganglionic neuron in the autonomic nervous system only conducts its electrical signal at about 2 miles an hour, so much, much slower. In terms of their neurotransmitters, they're a little bit different in that, so you see ACh, that stands for acetylcholine. Hopefully that sounds familiar. So remember back in chapter 9, we talked about the neuromuscular junction, which is where the alpha motor neuron meets the muscle cell. We talked about that the alpha motor neuron, when stimulated, is going to release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine crosses the synaptic cleft, so the gap between the neuron and the muscle cell, and then acetylcholine is going to bind to the sarcolemma, the cell membrane of the muscle cell, and it's going to cause it to depolarize. So it's going to allow the opening of chemically gated channels. I'm trying to build in a little bit of an exam review here as I'm going along. So acetylcholine then is the neurotransmitter of the somatic nervous system, right? So that's what all those alpha motor neurons are going to release, acetylcholine. When acetylcholine binds to the muscle cells, causes them to depolarize, causes muscle contraction. As opposed to, on the autonomic side of things, most of the neurons use acetylcholine, again, that ACh. So for example, on the parasympathetic side of things, the neurons use acetylcholine. And then on part of the sympathetic side, so those pre-ganglionic neurons use acetylcholine, but the post-ganglionic neurons on the sympathetic side use norepinephrine. So NE stands for norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is what's referred to as a neurohormone. So it is one where it is, in this case, released by a neuron and then causes either excitation or inhibition in the target tissue. But norepinephrine is also released by the adrenal medulla, aka your adrenal glands, or the inner portion of your adrenal glands, which sit atop your kidneys. And so when norepinephrine is released by your adrenal glands atop your kidneys, it spills into the blood, and then it exerts its effects through the bloodstream. So norepinephrine then can either be a neurotransmitter, or it can be a hormone that is released by your adrenal glands. But in this case, the post-ganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system use norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter. So different neurotransmitters between the two. And then their effects also differ. So for example, the autonomic nervous system can be either excitatory or inhibitory, as opposed to the somatic branch is always excitatory. So every time an alpha motor neuron on the somatic side releases acetylcholine, if it's sufficient to get that muscle cell to its threshold voltage, that muscle cell is going to contract, right? So on the somatic side, whenever they release acetylcholine, or whenever the alpha motor neuron releases acetylcholine, the effects are always excitatory. They always cause muscle contraction. As opposed to, on the autonomic side, effects, as you can see there, can be either excitatory or inhibitory. So it actually depends upon not so much the neurotransmitter as the receptor, because there are 5 different kinds of receptors. So it actually depends upon the type of receptor that binds to that neurotransmitter. So for example, so norepinephrine, as mentioned, is the neurotransmitter for the post-ganglionic neurons on the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. Might be helpful to have that flow chart handy as I'm going through this stuff. So remember the sympathetic side, that's fight or flight. And so whenever we stimulate the sympathetic side, it's going to increase heart rate, but also increase contractility of the cardiac muscle. So it's going to cause heart rate to speed up, so the heart beats faster, but also the heart contracts more strongly, and that ejects more blood with each beat. So that's obviously an excitatory effect. But that same neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, when it's released into the smooth muscle around the bronchioles, which are tubes inside of your lungs, norepinephrine released to that smooth muscle actually causes that smooth muscle to relax. So it's an inhibitory response. So norepinephrine in the heart is excitatory, but norepinephrine in the smooth muscle of the lungs is inhibitory. And again, it depends upon the type of receptor that receives that norepinephrine. That determines the difference. And obviously there's some overlap between the two. So to kind of capitalize on an example I've already used, if you start exercising, so obviously you choose to do that, right? You choose to start moving. That is somatic motor function. You chose to contract those muscles to propel yourself from point A to point B. But in order to meet the demands of that exercise, again, the muscle cells are going to need more oxygen to be able to keep up with the energy demands. And to do that, we're going to have to direct blood flow away from our abdominal and thoracic cavities, actually primarily away from the abdominal cavity, and we're going to have to direct blood flow to the muscles. And in addition to that, we're going to have to speed up heart rate. And so the autonomic nervous system makes that oxygen delivery possible for that voluntary muscle contraction from the somatic nervous system to take place. So that's one of the ways that they overlap. So here's kind of a picture of what I was just talking about. So I left a lot of tables and diagrams in this slideshow, particularly the one that's up in Canvas. That way, if you want to look at them while I'm going through this stuff, you can see it. But it's basically all the same stuff I just talked about. All right. So as mentioned, well, actually, I didn't talk about this yet. So never mind. Not as mentioned. So between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branches, for the most part, they both serve the same organs, but they cause opposite effects. And so oftentimes they're viewed as being antagonistic to each other, and largely they are. So I mentioned earlier the effect of each of the systems on heart rate. So remember that the parasympathetic branch decreases heart rate. The sympathetic branch increases it. So the parasympathetic branch, at least with respect to heart rate, acts as the brakes, and the sympathetic branch acts as the accelerator, or the gas. So both of them then act on the heart but produce different effects. Same thing in the lungs. So I mentioned the smooth muscle around your bronchioles, and that the sympathetic branch causes bronchodilation, so causes opening up of the tubes inside of your lungs, and so that way you can get more air into your lungs. And then the opposite effect then is that the parasympathetic branch causes bronchoconstriction, so it causes the smooth muscle around those tubes to contract and then decreases the diameter of those tubes, so decreases airflow into the lungs. So obviously during rest and digest, when you're just sitting around, you don't need a lot of airflow into the lungs, and so to minimize our energy usage, we'll then decrease the airflow into the lungs. So again, they overlap with each other but cause opposite effects. So like I said, the parasympathetic branch we associate with rest and digest because, again, its goal is to reduce energy use. So it's, again, going to slow down heart rate, but it also performs maintenance functions. And so, for example, it is going to increase GI motility. What does that mean? So GI means gastrointestinal, so that means everything from your esophagus, which is the tube that runs from your mouth to your stomach, through the stomach, through the small intestine, through the large intestine, and out. So that's gastrointestinal motility. It's moving things along the gastrointestinal tract. And so the parasympathetic branch stimulates muscle contraction throughout that gastrointestinal tract to propel food down your esophagus, through your stomach, through the intestines, and then eventually out. But it also plays a role in secretion of gastric juices. So in the stomach, you have to make acid and other gastric juices that we'll talk about in the next class. And so the parasympathetic branch stimulates the production of those, or at least the release of those. The parasympathetic branch, to some extent, decreases blood pressure, but not as directly as the sympathetic branch. So the sympathetic branch actually has more influence over blood pressure than the parasympathetic branch. So the sympathetic branch then, remember that's fight or flight. So it does all the things that we do during exercise is kind of a way to think about it. The responses to exercise or being scared are pretty similar. So during exercise, you're going to see an increase in heart rate, going to see an increase in blood pressure. Obviously, your breathing rate increases. We talked about bronchodilation, opening up the vessels inside of the lungs. You're going to get actually general vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction means closing down blood vessels. And so the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we talked about norepinephrine a minute ago. Epinephrine, aka adrenaline. So norepinephrine is also sometimes known as noradrenaline. Those are the British words. So epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are both released by the adrenal glands, again, that sit atop the kidneys. They dump into the blood. And so epinephrine, norepinephrine are general vasoconstrictors. They cause blood vessels to close down throughout the body. And so then the working musculature, due to local metabolic demands, kind of overrides that and opens up some nearby blood vessels. So the sympathetic branch then causes general vasoconstriction. But the reason it does that, because that does seem counterintuitive, is that it's going to close down blood vessels, again, throughout the body, but close down blood vessels in particularly the abdomen, to direct blood flow away from the kidneys, away from the liver, away from the stomach, so that we can use that blood instead to deliver oxygen to the working musculature. In addition to that, the sympathetic system is going to increase blood glucose, which is sugar, and so it's basically making sure you have the fuel you need to exercise or run away, either way. And then it's going to decrease gastrointestinal motility. So it's going to decrease digestion is kind of a way to think about that. Because, if you're running from a rabid dog or something, you can worry about digesting lunch later. Like, you got to get away first. And so it's going to slow down absorption of things that you ate during exercise just to make sure that you can get away from whatever that threat is. So again, the responses to exercise and the response to being afraid are pretty similar. So as an illustration of that, so what this is, and you'll see this diagram again in 202, but it's a diagram or demonstration of, depiction is probably a better word there, of blood flow at rest and then blood flow during exercise. So what you see here on the left, this is blood flow at rest, and so this number 5,800 milliliters per minute. So all of us have, give or take, 5 liters of blood. It depends upon your body size, but also your training status. So the larger you are and the better trained you are, particularly with respect to endurance athletes, the better trained you are, the more blood volume you have. So this person with their 5,800 milliliters or 5.8 liters is either big or pretty well conditioned. Either way, at rest, you can see that they send about 1.2 liters to the skeletal muscles, only about 250 mLs to the heart, or 0.25 liter to the heart, 750 to the brain, not very much to the skin, but you can see at rest that the kidneys get 1.1 liter, and then the abdomen, so things like the liver, the gastrointestinal tract, etc., get 1.4 liters. And then during exercise, so this is parasympathetic dominance here on the left. So this is rest and digest. So we're directing blood flow to the kidneys, we're directing blood flow to the abdominal organs. And then during exercise, so we've increased this blood flow here. The term for this is actually cardiac output. It's how much blood does the heart pump per minute. So we've increased that about 3 times during strenuous exercise to 17.5 liters. And so it's the same 5 liters, or in this case, 5.8 liters of blood. We're just turning it over more often. So as you increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, you just turn over that 5.8 liters faster. And so then that's what allows you to turn over 17.5 liters per minute. But the important part for our current discussion is with sympathetic dominance here on the right, you're going to see the brain's going to get its blood no matter what. That's good. We're going to see increased blood flow to the heart because the heart is having to beat more times per minute and contract more strongly, so it needs more oxygen. You see a huge increase here, basically 10 times increase to the skeletal muscles. Not really sure what this thing means, but a massive increase of blood flow to skeletal muscles because they're having to contract, and so they need more oxygen to make the energy currency, ATP. You can see a lot more blood flow to the skin. Why are we getting more blood flow to the skin? We're doing that so that we can start cooling ourselves off. So we're going to direct blood flow to the skin so we can give up some fluid as sweat, and then when that evaporates, that's going to help keep our core temperature down. So we direct blood flow to the skin during exercise to help keep ourselves cool. And you can see where the big drop-offs occur. So we're going to cut blood flow to the kidneys almost in half. And then we're going to cut blood flow to the rest of the abdomen, so the liver, the stomach, etc., more than in half, right? And then whatever other is, we're going to cut that down too. So the sympathetic branch then is going to cause, again, general vasoconstriction, general closing of the blood vessels, and then the working muscles open their local blood vessels back up, and so then they're going to see an increase in blood flow. It's also going to cause an opening of blood vessels near the skin, and so the skin's going to see an increase in blood flow, but then we're going to get decrease here. So again, this concept is what's referred to as blood shunting, directing blood to where it needs to go. So on the left side, we can think of as parasympathetic dominance, so lots of blood directed toward digestion and filtration. And then during exercise, we don't have to worry about digestion and filtration. We're worried about making sure the muscles can contract, supplying them with oxygen. And then heat dissipation is what you're seeing here. All right, so as mentioned, there are some anatomical differences between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system, but in addition to that, there are actually anatomical differences between the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So one of the differences is where they originate. So the picture you've got there is the origins of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So it's also known as the craniosacral branch. I won't refer to it as that, but it's also known as the craniosacral branch because the neurons, those pre-ganglionic neurons, sit either in the brainstem or in the sacral region of the spinal cord, and so that's what makes it craniosacral, is that's where the cell bodies of the pre-ganglionic neurons sit. As opposed to the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, is sometimes referred to as being thoracolumbar. So again, I won't refer to it as that, but its cell bodies, again, the pre-ganglionic cell bodies, sit in the spinal cord, and they originate there at T1, so at the very top of the thoracic portion of your spinal cord, and they terminate down here at L2. So it's thoracolumbar because it spans the thoraco section, or the thorax section of the spinal cord, and then runs down a little bit of the ways into the lumbar section. So parasympathetic branch then, craniosacral. The bodies of the pre-ganglionic neurons are in the brainstem and sacral section. Parasympathetic branch, thoracolumbar, its cell bodies are in the thoracic section and to some extent in the lumbar section of the spinal cord. All right, so another difference is the length of the fibers. So on the parasympathetic side, the pre-ganglionic neurons are really long. So they have really long axons. And so you can see here, for example, the one that's in the oculomotor nerve. So its cell body sits here in the brain stem. It has a relatively long axon that runs to a ganglion just posterior to your eye. And then it's going to use acetylcholine, its neurotransmitter, to relay a message to the post-ganglionic neuron, causing it to depolarize. And so then it affects musculature in the eye, smooth muscle in the eye. And so the distance traveled here by the post-ganglionic neuron is fairly short. So in the case of the parasympathetic side, the pre-ganglionic neurons are fairly long. The post-ganglionic neurons are fairly short. And so one of the things we'll talk about here in a little bit, you see, so this little ganglion is outside of the eye. This ganglion is outside of the salivary glands. But this ganglion, because it's inside of this box, is actually inside of the heart. And so those are what are referred to as intramural ganglion, which means literally inside the walls. And so those ganglion are actually inside the organs where they're going to cause their effects. So obviously if the ganglion is inside of the organ that the postsynaptic neuron is going to affect, that's going to be a pretty short axon. So those postganglionic fibers are pretty short on the parasympathetic side. As opposed to the sympathetic side, the preganglionic fibers are fairly short, and then the postganglionic fibers are fairly long. So for example, you'll see this in more detail here in a minute. So you've got a cell body here in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Its axon is going to run out the ventral root into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus, and then it's actually going to run into a ganglion called a trunk ganglion that sits just outside of the spinal cord. And then oftentimes they will, that presynaptic or not presynaptic, well it is that too, but that preganglionic neuron will then synapse at that trunk ganglion with the post-ganglionic neuron, and so then the post-ganglionic neuron is the one that's actually going to have influence over the effector organ, and so its fibers tend to be fairly long. So I kind of hinted at the location of the ganglia. So in the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, so the ganglia oftentimes are located in or near the effector organs. And so, for example, going back a little bit, maybe. Now we're going back. So this one, I'll show you a picture of this ganglion here in a second, but it is just posterior to the eye. So it's located pretty close. And as mentioned, a lot of these ganglion are actually in the organs that they affect. And so, yeah, that's the second part there, or the first part there. So the ganglia are located oftentimes inside the organ, so those are called intramural ganglia, or they're just really close, like the one with the eye here or with the salivary glands here. As opposed to, on the sympathetic side, the ganglia are located close to the spinal cord. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like, but basically the trunk ganglia kind of look like a string of pearls right next to your vertebral column. So they're kind of posterolaterally located, kind of posterolateral to the body of the vertebrae. And so they're located pretty close to the spinal cord for the most part. All right, so this is a chart. You can see it's table 14.1, but it's all the anatomical differences between the two. So again, just a chart showing you the same stuff that I was just talking about in case you don't want to sit through me talking and you'd rather look at it in chart form. All right, so now let's talk about the parasympathetic branch first. So remember that that's the craniosacral branch, and I told you I wouldn't use that, but it makes that picture on the right make a little bit more sense. So again, remember that the cell bodies from the parasympathetic division only originate in the brainstem, and you can see they're part of cranial nerves up here, or their fibers run in with the cranial nerves up here, and then the other fibers originate down here in the sacral part of the spinal cord. So we're going to start with the cranial part first. So all of these, the cell bodies for any of the cranial part of the parasympathetic division, the cell bodies for those sit in the brainstem. So you don't have to, I wouldn't want you to know like which part of the brainstem or anything like that, but hopefully you do know the parts of the brainstem from the chapter on the central nervous system, but you don't have to know that. So just be familiar with the concept that the cranial component of the parasympathetic division, those cell bodies sit in the brainstem. So, speaking of those, so their fibers run in with, as you can see there, cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve, as well as cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve, cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. So in the case of the third cranial nerve, again, you're going to have some cell bodies that sit in the brainstem, and then its fibers, the axon, is going to run in with cranial nerve 3, and then that pre-ganglionic neuron is going to synapse in something called the ciliary ganglion. And then it's going to relay its signal to the post-ganglionic neuron or post-ganglionic fibers, and then those will interact directly with the musculature of the eye, the smooth muscle of the eye. So on this first slide, I have the names of the ganglion. I don't want you to know those, but I do want you to be familiar with the autonomic function of the cranial nerves. So for example, the oculomotor nerves on the parasympathetic side are going to cause pupil constriction, so they're going to cause your pupil to close down, because again, we're at rest, so we probably don't need a whole lot of light coming inside the eye. I don't need to be super aware of my external environment because I'm at rest and I'm relaxed. So it's going to cause pupil constriction. It's also going to cause lens contraction, which helps you see things up close, because you're probably, sitting on your couch, maybe reading, maybe watching TV or Netflix or something, but it's probably relatively close to you, right? And so the parasympathetic branch then allows for lens contraction, which enables us to see things that are up close. And in terms of the pictures, to make things make more sense, so the autonomic fibers from cranial nerve 3 are going to originate here in an area, so it says pons here, but above the pons is the midbrain. So the fibers are actually going to originate, or the cell bodies are going to sit in the midbrain. Their axons come out along or inside of cranial nerve 3, and then they are going to synapse here with the ciliary ganglion. So this little bump here on the nerve, that's a cluster of cell bodies. That's a ganglion. So that particular one is the ciliary ganglion. So all of this then is our pre-ganglionic neuron and axon. It's bundled in there. And then the pre-ganglionic one is going to synapse here, going to secrete or going to release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to bind with the post-ganglionic neuron, which then sends an electrical signal out here, and that'll cause constriction there of the pupil, or again, that'll cause contraction of the lens, which then allows us to focus on things up close. So that's the way the ganglion look. So again, just a little bump on a nerve. In the case of the parasympathetic system, that bump is pretty close to the effector organ, or inside of the effector organ. In the case of the facial nerve, so I'm going to back up a little bit. So the facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. So the parasympathetic fibers inside of the cranial nerve stimulate the nasal or glands inside of the nasal cavity to secrete mucus, because we're resting and digesting, so we can secrete mucus, and therefore we can protect ourselves, because mucus serves an important protective function, helps trap bacteria and viruses and dust and all that stuff we don't want down inside our lungs. So at rest then, we will secrete mucus from those nasal glands to help us protect ourselves. The lacrimal glands are the tear ducts, so it's actually parasympathetic fibers that cause the production of tears. And so, again, this is a named ganglia that is outside of the effector organs, the pterygopalatine. There we go, pterygopalatine. I almost said Palpatine, like Star Wars. Anyway, the pterygopalatine ganglion is right there. And so you can see it has two branches. You don't need to know this. But the top, this one, is going to, as you can see, is going to affect the tear ducts and also the nasal glands. And then the lower one, which goes to submandibular ganglion, is going to affect salivary glands. So in the facial nerves, then, the relevant things to know is that the parasympathetic fibers inside the facial nerve, or facial nerves because there's a left and a right, the parasympathetic fibers cause mucus production from the nasal glands, tear production, and then saliva production. So that's what happens from the autonomic fibers in the facial nerve. And then the autonomic fibers in the glossopharyngeal nerve, which again is cranial nerve 9. So those are going to also produce saliva, so that should help economize your studying. So the facial nerves, the autonomic fibers in the facial nerves, or sorry, parasympathetic fibers in the facial nerves and the parasympathetic fibers in the glossopharyngeal nerves both stimulate salivary glands. Now the vagus nerve is different. So the vagus nerve, remember that the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, the name means vagabond or wanderer because it's the only cranial nerve that exits the head and neck region, and so it's actually going to run down into the thoracic cavity and also into the abdominal cavity. And so the vagus nerve is going to form, as you can see here, plexuses. So there are several different plexuses. You don't need to know any of them, but cardiac and pulmonary plexus. There's also an esophageal plexus. But one thing that is helpful to know is that a plexus is an interweaving network of nerves. So remember, last time we talked about the brachial plexus, right? And the brachial plexus was this interweaving of nerves from nerve roots C5 down to T1, right? And so similar concept here. The cardiac plexus is this interweaving of axons that includes actually both parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers. So the cardiac plexus relays the fibers that both speed up and slow down heart rate. Sticking with what we're talking about now, though, in the case of the vagus nerves, so they slow down heart rate. They, again, act on the SA node, which you don't need to know, sorry. They slow down heart rate. They're going to can decrease your breathing rate. They're going to cause your airways in the lungs to close down, so an antagonistic effect, especially there to the sympathetic branch. They're going to cause blood vessels around your stomach and around your intestines to open up, and then as I mentioned earlier, it's going to cause contraction of the smooth muscle around the GI tract to help propel food through the gastrointestinal tract. All right, so that's the cranial part. Now we're going to move on to the sacral part. So now we're down here at the bottom. So all of these neurons, all their cell bodies, sit in the gray matter between S2, so again the sacral section of the spinal cord, and S4. So these actually have, as do many of these, but these have really long pre-ganglionic axons. So the pre-ganglionic axon actually runs all the way out to the effector organ, and then the ganglion is inside the walls of the effector organ, and so then the post-ganglionic fibers are fairly short. So down here in the sacral section, these, I don't know, let's just go with these axons. So these axons are going to form part of the splanchic nerves, which is this fun little word here, splanchic. So they form the splanchic nerves, and then the sympathetic fibers also form those. We'll get to those in a minute. But the parasympathetic fibers are going to, again, cause increased absorption because increased blood flow and increased muscle contraction around the intestines to propel things through the GI tract. They'll cause your urinary bladder to contract, so they cause you to have to use the restroom, and then cause contraction of the ureters, and then they're also responsible for stimulation. All right, so sympathetic fibers. All right, so on to the fight or flight side of things. So the two are obviously fairly similar. The sympathetic side is a little bit more complex. Things to know about it. So as mentioned at the outset, they both, for the most part, innervate the same sets of organs, but there's a little bit of a difference between the organs that they innervate. So the parasympathetic side of things, talked about what it does, but for the most part, it affects things inside of the body cavities, right? So it affects organs inside the thoracic cavity, inside the abdominal cavity, inside of the GI tract, etc. So one of the differences from a structural standpoint is the fact that the sympathetic branch also innervates the superficial or somatic part of the body. So it innervates things like your sweat glands, those little, so the muscles are actually called erector pili, but they're the little muscles that are attached to your hair, or I was going to say hair cells, they're not cells. They're muscles inside of your hair follicles that when stimulated cause contraction of the little muscles and cause your hair to stand on end. So the muscles that raise your body hairs that cause them to stand on end or to stand up, those are innervated by sympathetic fibers as well as sweat glands as mentioned. And then the sympathetic fibers also innervate smooth muscle around more superficial arteries and veins. So they play a role in directing blood flow to the skin, which assists in cooling us off, as mentioned, during exercise. In addition to that, one of the other differences, so the sympathetic fibers have a little more direct influence over the heart in that, so both the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch affect heart rate. Parasympathetic slows it down, sympathetic speeds it up, but only the sympathetic side affects myocardial contractility, which is how hard your heart beats, which is the harder your heart beats, the more your blood pressure goes up. So only the sympathetic side then increases blood pressure. So it is the primary determinant of blood pressure. The parasympathetic side can't cause a decrease in myocardial contractility because it simply doesn't connect to those ventricles, to the parts of the heart that are going to be contracting. All right, so earlier we touched on the fact that this is the thoracolumbar branch, so it runs from T1 to L2 inside of the spinal cord. The cell bodies of all of these neurons sit in the lateral horns of the spinal cord. So remember, previously we talked about the spinal cord, so there are two ventral horns. Remember, ventral is the front, so there's a ventral horn here and a ventral horn here. That's where the cell bodies of the alpha motor neurons sit. And then you have the dorsal horns, so back here on the back side. So that's where those sensory neurons are going to synapse. And then over here, it's pretty slight, but you see this little bulge right there. That is a lateral horn. So in this case, that's the left lateral horn of the spinal cord. So that's where the cell bodies for these, for the autonomic nervous system sit. So between T1 and L2, those are cell bodies of the sympathetic fibers. So those cell bodies then obviously have axons, and those axons then run out the anterior aspect, so out the ventral aspect of the spinal cord, and they go into the ventral root here. So remember, motor information goes out the front, sensory information comes in the back, and since we're talking about motor function here, their axons run out that ventral root into the spinal nerve. So here's the spinal nerve. And then remember that you have a dorsal ramus, rami is plural, so dorsal ramus here, and then a ventral ramus here. And so that's that split right after the spinal nerve. And then what you're going to see, so I'll actually come down to the bottom here where they're labeled. So you have a white ramus communicans and a gray ramus communicans. So I'm going to go back up to the top. So our axon that came out, that ventral root through the spinal nerve, through the ventral ramus, that axon is actually going to run back this way through the white ramus communicans to this thing, which, as you can see, is a sympathetic trunk ganglion. I'm just going to refer to it as a trunk ganglion. And so again, a ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies, and then you have this whole thing is called the sympathetic trunk, right? And so it runs along the spinal cord, actually runs from the cervical section all the way down into the pelvis. But the cell bodies only issue axons from T1 to L2. But this runs up and down along the spinal cord. So our particular axon is going to exit here, and then it's going to go back this way into the sympathetic trunk ganglion, which it can synapse there with the post-ganglionic neuron, which then its axon runs out through the gray ramus communicans, back into the ventral ramus, and then out to the effector organ. So it makes this weird little loop, and then out is kind of how it works. So you've noticed there's a color difference here: white ramus communicans, gray ramus communicans. Remember, it's the same. The reason for the color difference is the same as it was when we talked about the central nervous system. So remember, in the spinal cord you have gray matter and then white matter all around it. Remember that gray matter is cell bodies and also unmyelinated neurons. And then in the white matter, that is myelinated axons. So remember that in the sympathetic branch, the pre-ganglionic neuron is myelinated. And so that myelinated axon's coming out here. Myelinated axons, cluster of them, is what makes the white ramus communicans white. And then synapses with the post-ganglionic neuron, which is unmyelinated. So then the axons have that kind of gray appearance because they don't have that fat wrapping around them. And so the gray ramus communicans are clusters of unmyelinated axons. And then they feed again back into this ventral ramus and then out. All right, so we covered all that stuff. So once our sympathetic fibers reach, or our pre-ganglionic neuron, once it reaches the trunk ganglion, it can do three things. So the first one is it can synapse there, which is the example I gave you earlier, because that's the most straightforward thing. So it can synapse here, and then the post-ganglionic neuron can then carry the message out to the effectors. And so we see that with things like the sweat glands. So those will go straight out to the sweat glands, or to the erector pili muscles I mentioned earlier, or to any of the blood vessels along the way. Or rather than synapsing at that same trunk level, or trunk ganglion level, the pre-ganglionic axon can actually run back here into this trunk ganglion, and then it can run either up or down that trunk. So we see that especially in the case of neurons that affect the head and neck, because again, the cell bodies only extend as high or as superiorly as T1. So neurons that sit between T1 and T4, their axons actually run up the sympathetic trunk into the neck, and then, as you'll see in a second, a few of them actually run in with the cranial nerves. So they can synapse either higher or lower, or they can synapse in what's called a collateral ganglion. So collateral ganglion are only found in the abdomen and pelvis, and they are away from the spinal cord. They don't have pairs like this. So there would be, in this case, a left one and a right one on the other side. So they're not paired like that. And then again, they are kind of away from the spinal cord. So those are going to be responsible for innervating abdominal organs, is where we'll see the collateral ganglion come in. And then, there we go. So this graphic is what I just showed you. So this is the three things that can happen. So we can either synapse at the same level and go out, which you can see there affects the skin, or we can synapse, went the wrong one. We can come out here and synapse and go up. And so you can see that can affect a blood vessel. Or we can synapse, or actually, sorry, not synapse, and go straight through this trunk ganglion and then out to one of the collateral ganglion and then affect, in that case, the large intestine. All right, let's see. So pre and post ganglion. So we talked about the white and gray ramus communicans. We talked about this. I mentioned pathways to the head. So what ends up happening here, for those sympathetic neurons that go up the sympathetic trunk, some of those fibers go out to the oculomotor nerve. So the oculomotor nerve on the sympathetic side, the effects are going to be two. The first is that you're going to get pupil dilation. So you're actually going to open your pupil up. And then you're also going to get stimulation of the muscle that controls your eyelids. So your eyes are going to open wider. So you're probably familiar, from watching horror movies or whatever. Like the reaction to being scared is pupil dilation. Your pupils open up, and then you get, eyes wide, like trying to take in as much information as I can. And so that is a product of sympathetic stimulation acting through the oculomotor nerve to dilate the pupils and then to keep your eyes open, because you want to be able to take in as much light and as much information as possible. So that's the sympathetic effect through the oculomotor nerve. And then the sympathetic effect through the facial nerve is to inhibit mucus glands in the nasal cavity and then to inhibit salivary glands. So remember we talked about if you're resting and digesting, well, you can make a bunch of mucus inside of the nasal cavity to trap bacteria and dust, etc. But if you are having to run away from something or you're scared or whatever, we don't need to devote energy to releasing mucus right now. We can worry about the immune system later. We got to get away. And so in the facial nerves, the sympathetic fibers are antagonistic to the parasympathetic fibers. They're going to inhibit the production of mucus from the nasal glands, and they're also going to inhibit saliva production from obviously the salivary glands. And so that is why if you get nervous or scared, you have to do a presentation in front of the class or something like that, and your mouth gets dry, that's because of that sympathetic stimulation that's inhibiting saliva production. So that's what produces that sort of that dry mouth sensation. In terms of pathways to the thorax, there are some obviously direct routes, because again, the sympathetic neurons are at every level of the spinal cord and in the thorax. So there's a direct route where they'll actually, and I think I have a picture of that here. There we go. So there's a direct route where they'll come out, they'll synapse, and then they'll go straight through to the heart through the plexus, right? So you go through the cardiac plexus, get to the heart, or you can come out through here, go through the pulmonary plexus, and then go to the lungs to cause bronchodilation. But they can also take a really indirect route where they can actually go up and then synapse and come up through the cervical ganglion and then back down. So they can take a fairly indirect route as well. And so the sympathetic nerves that innervate the heart and the lungs do both. So there's some that have a direct route, and then there's some that have the less direct route where they actually go up and then come back down. All right. So sympathetic fibers a little lower down. So in the abdomen and pelvis. So remember, collateral ganglia are clusters of cell bodies away from the spinal cord, and so they're just these little yellow dots here. They're typically named for the blood vessels, the arteries that they run closest to. So you'll see celiac ganglion, inferior mesenteric. So they're named for the arteries that are near them. That's where those names come from. And then what do I want you to know here? I guess the big thing I want you to know here is that the ones in the abdominal cavity, the sympathetic fibers are going to inhibit gastrointestinal motility. So again, we can digest later. We got to get away right now. And so they also inhibit excretion, so you won't have to use the restroom generally, and you generally won't have to defecate, and then you generally won't have to urinate when the sympathetic branch is active. Now, obviously, you can override that, but in general, the urge usually goes away or is reduced. And then the adrenal medulla. So I don't think I have a better picture of the adrenal gland, but what you've got over here, so this is your kidney, and then sitting atop it is the adrenal gland, which produces epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then other hormones that we'll talk about in 202. And so rather than synapsing, you can see, try to find my direct line here, another splanchic nerve, because again, those contain both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. The neurons that affect the adrenal medulla will actually run right through this ganglion without synapsing, and they continue on to the adrenal medulla, where then they stimulate the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, which again are neurohormones. So not only is norepinephrine a neurotransmitter that affects tissues like smooth muscle or the heart, it also is produced by the adrenal glands and dumped into the blood. And then they can exert their effect by being circulated in the blood as well. So you can ignore this slide. I'm going to just fly right past it. Initially, I was thinking it would be a good idea to talk to you about the different kinds of receptors, but nah. So we're going to skip that. All right, so this is kind of a summary of what we've been talking about most of the time. So while under certain circumstances, the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch can work together, for the most part, they are antagonistic to each other. They do opposite things. So as mentioned, sympathetic branch, fight or flight, increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, dilates your airways, inhibits digestion, inhibits elimination, increases blood sugar, increases lipolysis, which is breakdown of fat. So between the increased blood glucose and the increased lipolysis, it's trying to free up fuel to provide energy for exercise or for getting away from whatever you need to get away from. And then the parasympathetic branch does all the opposite things, right? So it's going to decrease heart rate, it's going to constrict your airways, so cause bronchoconstriction, increase gastrointestinal motility, help you defecate and urinate, and then increase glucose uptake by the liver so that you can store that glucose inside of the liver and make glycogen to keep your blood sugar up later when you're fasting. So a couple other things, just things that I think are interesting. So, for example, we talked about epinephrine, norepinephrine. So epinephrine you may have heard of in terms of EpiPens. So EpiPens, what do? Well, so if you release epinephrine into the bloodstream, you're going to get all those sympathetic effects that we talked about. So where do we see EpiPens? We usually see them in response to an allergic reaction. So if you have peanuts and you're not supposed to have peanuts, one of the things that can happen there is that you get bronchoconstriction. So you get a spasm. You actually get too much parasympathetic influence over the muscles, the smooth muscle around the airways and the lungs. So you're going to close them down. And so then that makes it hard to breathe, and potentially that can result in death, right? So to offset that, we can administer an epinephrine pen, an EpiPen, which then is going to produce all those sympathetic effects. So it's going to increase heart rate and do all those other things. But among those things, it's going to cause bronchodilation. So it's going to open those airways back up that the allergic response to the peanuts or the bee sting or whatever, it offsets that allergic response and opens your airway back up so that they can breathe again and so that the allergic reaction won't be fatal. We also see that with inhalers. So inhalers are going to cause those sympathetic effects. So if you have asthma and you take an inhaler, those essentially stimulate that sympathetic effect, and so then that causes bronchodilation. So that's where some of these things come in from a practical standpoint. A couple other things. Sympathetic tone. So as mentioned earlier, the sympathetic side is most responsible for maintaining blood pressure, in part because, again, it exerts influence over the chambers of the heart and can make the muscle directly contract more strongly or not. But also, the sympathetic branch directly innervates almost all blood vessels. So, or the blood vessels, yeah, let's leave it at that. So the sympathetic branch directly innervates blood vessels. And so what it does then is it keeps all of your blood vessels in a continual state of partial constriction. And so what that's going to do then is that's going to help keep your blood pressure up. If your blood pressure gets too high, so think about last time we talked about the baroreceptors, which are a modified kind of a stretch receptor in the aortic or in the aorta and also in the carotid arteries. Remember, the baroreceptors monitor blood pressure, and if blood pressure gets too high, they act as sort of the governor or the brakes on your blood pressure. And so what they do then is they decrease reflexively sympathetic influence. So they decrease sympathetic outflow, and so then that's going to reduce how hard the heart is contracting, but that's also then going to cause some vasodilation. It's going to open the blood vessels up a little bit, and so that's then going to help bring your blood pressure back down. So the sympathetic branch between the two is the one primarily responsible for maintaining blood pressure, and that little bit of constant contraction around all your blood vessels, that's what's referred to as sympathetic tone. So the sympathetic tone helps govern your blood pressure. Parasympathetic tone, on the other hand, obviously decreases heart rate, but the more important thing for a parasympathetic tone is that it's going to facilitate digestion. So you have these regular waves of smooth muscle contraction in the stomach, but particularly in the intestines, called peristalsis. And so those happen It depends on which one we're talking about, but give or take every 90 minutes. And so that is part of parasympathetic tone, those regular contractions of the smooth muscle around the small intestine, which then facilitates excretion. And then the last thing, so here's all the effects. Again, I think a handy little table here. So it tells what each one does. So for example, I kept talking about pupil constriction or dilation. Remember, the parasympathetic system then is going to constrict the pupils. We don't need as much light in if we're resting. Or the sympathetic side is going to dilate the pupils, because if I'm scared and need to run away, I need as much visual information as possible. So we're going to get pupil dilation on the sympathetic side. So here's just a handy table of what all they do. And then here's the rest of the same table. All right, now we're on to the last thing. So as mentioned, way back in chapter 12, so the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, is going to supervise or oversee the autonomic nervous system. So as you can see there, the anterior regions direct the parasympathetic functions. They're going to direct rest and digest. The posterior regions of the hypothalamus are going to direct sympathetic functions. So one of the things that might have thrown you off for a second there, or that you might have thought about, is you said, okay, well, you said that the parasympathetic branch is overseen by the hypothalamus, but then you also said previously when we were talking about the brain that the cardiac center that regulates heart rhythm is in the brainstem. All of that is true. So the hypothalamus is going to synapse, so it has neurons that interact with the brainstem, and by that interaction with the cardiac center or with the respiratory center, the hypothalamus then is going to control things like heart rate and blood pressure. So they do it. So the hypothalamus is the one initiating a lot of the signals, but it synapses, it acts through the brainstem. And as mentioned earlier, so for the most part, the autonomic nervous system functions under unconscious control, so it just happens. But you can exert some conscious control. So for example, these are stressful times for any number of reasons, but including because final exams are coming up. And so, maybe you're stressed out about that, and so then you become sympathetic dominant, right? So then you get increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, and all those kinds of things. And so all that's happening unconsciously. But it is in response to a conscious stimulus. You're like, I got 5 papers due next week. I got this stupid exam for structure and function, and I got all these other ridiculous things, and so I'm so stressed out. And so then that conscious information leads to an unconscious response, increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, etc. But then conversely, you can consciously shift it to some extent the other way through things like meditation, breathing exercises, all the things that you would learn about in the stress management course, 362 if you took that one. So that is trying to exert some conscious control over these unconscious responses. And so by doing those, hopefully you can shift from being sympathetic dominant to more parasympathetic dominant, and then that can have those antagonistic effects, those opposite effects, where we're going to decrease your heart rate, hopefully decrease your blood pressure, etc. All right, so that's it. That's all I have for you. So good luck on the last test, good luck on the final exam, and I look forward to reading your pathology papers.